Hey class, I hope you're staying well out there. This is part 2 of our lecture on chapter 4, the Prehistoric Aegean. My subtitle for this is The Age of Heroes. We left off last time looking at some frescoes from the palace in Knossos from the Minoan civilization. We're going to continue on with the Minoan civilization today, and we're going to be talking about some sculptural objects, a sculpture and a piece of pottery, and then looking at another site besides their site of Knossos. That's an important place for them. And then we're going to transition into the Mycenaean culture, which we'll see was influenced by Minoan culture. So let's get started. The first object we're going to look at is called Snake Goddess. It's from the palace at Knossos. So the building we've been looking at that the mythological idea of the labyrinth is based off of, this was found in that place. I want you to study it for a minute and see what you can see about it. What do you notice? It's an interesting piece. It's not very, very big. It's only about 13.5 inches, 1 foot, 1.5 inches. So, I mean, it's not tiny, but it's not large, monumental. If you notice so far, we do not have any giant monumental sculpture of gods or kings like we have had in the last 2 chapters with Egypt and the Near East. So that's something that's interesting. In these cultures, we haven't had those giant sculptures. What do you think this piece is showing or depicting? If you look at it, we obviously see a woman, and we have this figure on the top. It's not quite exactly clear right away what it is. And then in her hands she has these squiggly lines. Okay? Right here and here. What creatures from nature have squiggly lines like that? Or are that type of shape? They are snakes. Okay? And on her head is a cat up here. So this is the mythological earliest version of a crazy cat lady, you could say. So she's a Mother Earth goddess or possibly priestess. And we again could say she's a symbol for fertility. Her breasts are fully exposed. So they have there's that type of idea of fertility, nature, and she's definitely a woman. See, the snakes are interesting because for us they may hold an evil connotation, like we have with Adam and Eve, snake in the garden, and other types of ideas of serpents and things that are from different books and mythologies. For these people, that would probably be us applying our modern ideas onto them. We could actually think of her having these as in snakes are a symbol of the earth and agriculture. So her holding them is an idea of her like as a goddess holding snakes would be she's the mistress or captain of the beasts. Common theme in ancient Near East and later Greek art is this idea that she's the mistress of the beast. She is a Mother Earth goddess. You can see from this next slide kind of some of the illustration of this is a cat on top of her head. So again, it continues this idea that she is has a cat headdress, that the cat is with her, that she is in charge of nature, so to speak. It's made of faience, which is a shiny surface. It's a paste of glass with bright colors made of crushed quartz or sand, and it looks much like glazed pottery. And there's definitely a frontal focus to the piece. It's in the round. You could turn it all the way around, but the frontal focus, because her face is here, her exposed breasts, the snakes, almost all the detail on this is called a flounced skirt that she has, where it has those little pieces of fabric that overlap each other. That's all on the front. So it's focused on her as a figure as a personality that we're supposed to interact with. We get some idea of this, the religion of the Minoans from this. We have some ideas so far that we've talked about of them having double axes and rituals with bulls. And this is an interesting image because if it is a priestess, we have not seen priestesses so far in the book. So this would be a new thing. But we have here some ideas about the way in which they relate to nature. And we know that they worshipped in the rites of spring and the harvest. So harvest and growth times. And they had shrines in their palaces as well as outdoor columns in nature. So this is kind of building on these ideas that we've been talking about with fertility, the bulls being power symbols, and this builds on the idea of nature and fertility being an important part of their worldview and their religious rituals to try to continue on having their crops grow and to be wealthy, etc., etc. Much like we've been talking about in other societies and other cultures. The next piece we're going to look at is Octopus Flask. It's also from Crete. It's from a different site here, not Gnosis. This is an interesting piece because it's functional terracotta ware. Terracotta meaning cooked earth, terracotta. It's made to be usable, so this is different, even though it's very decorative. It was most likely made on a pottery wheel, which was introduced about 200 years earlier than this date. And it's 11 inches high, so almost a foot, pretty large size piece of pottery. It's got a lot of really rhythmic, stylistic motion to it. And in this we can see that a common sort of energetic quality to their work, that there's a rhythmic, decorative surface quality. We had it here with the geometry and the sort of repetition of things. We definitely had it back here with these paintings, right, with the rhythmic, dynamic energy to them. Well, it continues on here in their functional wear. So, very energetic design, which is typical of Minoan pottery. These natural forms, which we see here in octopus, fill up the whole of the flask. And then there's pieces of vegetable type of material, like seaweed and such, around, spread throughout, giving it a really energetic quality. What about its stylization? Well, I think it's interesting that there's a repetition, purposeful repetition of circular shapes throughout the whole thing. This has a unity to it with an all-over design. Even in the handle, we get a repetition of those circle shapes like the eyes and the suction pads in the piece. So there's a very well-developed design aesthetic in this. And even the entire thing is circular. So there's a repetition of circles throughout at various sizes and scales, which makes it pretty interesting. And this all-over design makes it feel very energetic. What does it show as a subject? Well, it shows an octopus and other sea life. From this, we can get the idea that pretty obviously they must have loved the sea. They were a culture that loved nature and the sea because they lived on an island. And in their time of dominance, they really did control the Aegean. So they were very much a seafaring people. And this is pretty evident in their choice of motif decoration on this piece of functional wear. It's pretty amazing. How did they add this to the piece, do you think? Has anyone taken ceramics before? Maybe you have. If you have, you probably heard of something called slip, which is colored clay that you put onto either wet or bisque-fired clay to create the design or to create imagery and add color to a piece. So this is slip applied to the clay, which is a darker color clay applied to the clay that made the flask. We're going to be moving on to another site of Minoan culture that was important. It's modern-day Santorini. To them it was known as Terra, and it's the modern-day, like I said, Greek Isle of Santorini. It has this giant hole-like structure in the middle of it, kind of amazing, because they're pretty sure this is it right here, Terra. So in relationship to Crete, it's a little bit north and east, but in the same Aegean region. They think they're sure that that hole that's in it is because of a gigantic volcanic eruption. And this eruption probably happened between 1700 and 1500 BC and was probably part of the downward spiral of Minoan civilization. There weren't any human remains when it was excavated, so they probably were able to tell that it was going to happen. They had some warning, and they left before it actually blew up. It was a giant explosion, though, too. Can you imagine taking out a whole part of an island with a giant eruption? So that was a really, really sizable volcanic eruption from prehistory. If you notice where Terra is located between Crete and the rest of mainland Europe, it's an important site for them, we think, because of trade and the trade routes. There was a lot of luxury here in this city. This is probably what it would have looked like before. So we lost quite a lot of it when they were in this volcanic eruption. When I say we lost quite a lot of the site, but because of volcanic eruption, they left behind things for people to dig up and be excavated because it was covered in ash. So before 1500 BC, that would have been an entire island, and it was like 40 atomic bombs going off. Because of it, archaeologists have been able to go into that island and find pieces of their culture that have been deeply buried in ash. It's pretty amazing. Sporidon Martinos is the main archaeologist in charge of the beginning of excavating this site. The ash from the volcanic eruption preserved a lot of the objects and different things, buildings. And we'll find this again in a later chapter where a giant eruption, Mount Vesuvius, preserves some things from another culture. So this is a really kind of like a gift to archaeologists and historians to get a piece of time, a place in a piece of time that was almost frozen by the volcanic eruption. Pretty useful for trying to understand this culture. It was a luxurious place. It kind of gives us some idea of how much wealth and money they had as a culture. There was an attention to luxury not found like this in the West until Rome 1,000 years later. They had paved streets, houses of stone and mud. The upper parts would have been for living, and the lower part basements and workspaces. They had mills and attached to houses and farming. They were a farming people as well as seafaring. Their walls were reinforced with timber and straw for flexibility in earthquakes. So they must have had seismic activity in this area because of the volcano. And they had even clay pipes with interior baths and toilets and a sewage system underneath the street. So you say, oh yeah, well, big deal, who cares? You have to remember we're talking about, 1500 BC, thousands of years ago, and they had an indoor plumbing. It's pretty amazing, really. I'm going to have you stop the video right now and watch this video clip from Khan Academy about some frescoes that were found at Terra. It's not the cleanest way to do it, as I've said once before, but I have to do it this way because I can't embed this video into the slideshow. So it's the page that says videos from slide lecture, and you're going to be able to see them there and click on them. There's a couple of them throughout this lecture, so you'll just go ahead and pause it and then open up another tab and then watch it and then come back to this once you're done with that. I hope you enjoyed that video. I like how it shows you a bit more about the volcanic eruption and lays out a little bit of illustrations about how frescoes are built up over straw, rough plaster to fine plaster. But I especially appreciate it for the interesting part about earliest forms of landscape painting that your book also talks about. So this is an interesting video for you to watch because it reinforces some of the ideas from the book and brings out some nuances to be able to see it in video. Alright, going on from there, there's some really interesting frescoes. This is from your book. It's one of the details from the left section of a frieze. And a frieze, if you imagine, is a long continuous panel of, it could be sculpture, relief, it could be a painting like this, or it could be on a pot, but it's a continual band of like some sort of imagery. They could be geometric even, or like abstract, but oftentimes pictorial imagery like this. So it's an interesting piece because it has some sort of depiction of the return of a fleet or a ceremonial rite. And here in this is the island itself. And you'll see that they have these really beautiful depictions of dolphins in nature, and the way that they've depicted animals on their island and the beauty of it. But it's interesting how they have the island sort of enclosing the city here, and then these ships are coming out with big dolphins. They don't use scale in the same way we would do, in realistic work now, of course. It's more of a schematic map of their idea of nature, and very, very, very celebratory. They have some overlap to show depth, but they mostly use distance, height to denote distance. So the top things are further back in space rather than any kind of realistic perspective. It was found in a private house. So they have luxury art in private houses and in public buildings. So this kind of shows their wealth. In it we have also depictions of the harbor, and that we get some ideas of how the figures are dressed. So that's very, very important for us to understand their culture, the depictions of themselves, how they show themselves as part of their idea of the world and who they are in it, right? This is the most significant of the frescoes that were preserved. You can see it closer here with the figures, the kind of robe type clothing they wore, and then the type of clothing they wore when they were directing the boats and on the boats. It was part of a longer frieze, so this is the left panel, the middle continues on, and then there's a further side with more ships and another scene of the city. I'm sorry I don't have better quality images of these. It's hard to find good quality of those parts of it. This part is in your book. The rest of it is not. So it's a one long continuous panel that has this ritual on it. They think possibly be a ritual of some sort. Really interesting. Alright, that takes us through the Minoans, and there's a lot of interesting things we could go further into with that culture. They really were like one of the first great Western civilizations, as I said at the beginning of the Minoan section. So there's more and more to find out about if you dig into it and you're interested in it. There's a lot more you could read and check out about their society. Pretty cool art objects, and I really love the way that they use color, and there's like a dynamism to their work that we haven't quite seen in other cultures so far. Moving on to the next culture, the Mycenaeans. their civilization was about 1600 to 1100 BC. So I want to make something clear that these cultures had some overlap. It's not as if all of a sudden the Minoans disappeared, boom, and then the Mycenaeans came on the scene. There's overlap and interaction between the cultures. And we're going to see that in this part of the lecture, because there is a link between them, Minoan and Mycenaean art and culture, and the way they depict some things. And even if you remember earlier in the first lecture, I talked about how Linear B was using their script. The Mycenaeans used some of the Minoans' writing, their script, and adapted it for their own purposes. So there's very much a borrowing of parts of Minoan culture from the Mycenaeans. So some goals we're going to want to look at are understanding the link between culture and architecture in Mycenae, identifying their important architectural achievements. I talked to you about this before, that they did some things that will influence later cultures. And then the relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaean culture, how the Mycenaeans were influenced by the Minoans. So Mycenaean culture is named after their primary site, Mycenae, but they had more sites than just this around the Aegean. These are their main, these little ones are settlements, and these big square ones are their important fortresses. So they were found throughout this whole peninsula area, and then look at all the islands, the Cycladic Isles, and then they even took over and ruled Crete from Knossos as well. They had one of their main sites there. Not long after the eruption of that volcano on Terra, Mycenaean culture began to really be in power. And there's some idea that maybe that eruption sort of had a really ill effect on the Minoans, and that's part of why their decline happened. I've read quite a bit about this. I'm not sure if I fully agree with it or believe it, but that is something that different historians would suggest. So that's an interesting idea. How something cataclysmic like a giant natural disaster can have an effect on the entire civilization. There's maybe something to be said for that. In a lot of ways, this culture is really important to us because they're the forerunners of Greek culture on mainland Greece, which is located here. And this is when we're tying in that idea, again, of the age of heroes, of a golden age of heroes before that people like Homer were looking back to talk about their mythology. There's this archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, and he was convinced that the Greek myths were based on history. The myths from Homer, his Iliad, the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, and he was searching for the truth of the Trojan Wars. So this is the face of that man who wanted to know the truth of the Trojan Wars. He thought, we've talked about Homer already, Sophocles, Euripides, he thought these pieces of fiction were based on history, and he wanted to know about the truth of it. So the Trojan Wars, to give you a really, really quick recap, is King Agamemnon here he led the Greek army against Troy because his brother, the king of Sparta, married Helen of Troy, who was a legendary beauty from ancient times. So she's considered this legendary beauty that his brother married. There's different movies about these type of ideas. And then Paris, the son of the king of Troy, so the prince of Troy, he abducted Helen. And basically because of that, a war started because he wanted revenge because of the offense against his brother. So Agamemnon goes and attacks Troy. And this is where you get the idea of a Trojan horse. You've heard about this. And they use that as a way of talking about malware, right? On computers, cyber attack, because it's a gift that you let inside of your walls and then out comes the enemy. So this figure of speech, Trojan Horse, comes from this mythology. Agamemnon is a pretty sad character from mythology. He has this idea where the winds refuse to blow because he had killed the stag of Artemis, a sacred animal. And so because of that, Artemis, who's a goddess, she requires him to sacrifice his daughter for the winds to blow in his favor. And he does. And then 10 years after the war ended, he returned home and to be murdered by his unforgiving wife because he sacrificed his daughter. And then in turn, his children kill their mother to avenge him. So it's a terrible... Some parts of Greek mythology really are a terrible view of everything. One person killing another and da-da-da. It goes on and on. It's sometimes pretty sad. That's part of where we get some of our current versions of sad plays and things from, right? The origin of things like tragedy and comedy. This influenced Shakespeare, who influenced most of English language, fiction. So this is definitely part of a core part of Western civilization's literary and artistic foundation. So Schliemann, let's get back to the history of it. Schliemann wants to prove out the history of this. And so he goes to begin to excavate these sites in Mycenae. We're looking at an area right here in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. This is the foremost of their sites, and this is the landscape. And we're looking at the approach up to the Mycenaean Citadel sort of area where the Megaron is. This is how it looks as you go up to these walls, and this is what we're going to be spending quite a bit of time looking at here. It was a massive fortified hilltop. It had really, really large defensive walls, and we can see from that a culture that was definitely more involved in war. The nobility had nice homes, but regular citizens had mud homes, and they would be out in these areas as well. And they would go to the city in the times of attack when they needed defense. The walls are made of dense, really large stones, and you can see how fortified it was. It's pretty amazing. This is a sort of overview of what we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at the Megaron. We look at the main gate, and we've just been looking at kind of the approach up to it. And then we're going to look at a couple other buildings and grave circles inside here, but I just want to give you a sort of general idea of it real quick before we go any further. This is probably how it may have looked back when it was fully functional, shall we say. Artist rendition of it. And there would have been other houses and things around the area. Like I said, the lower class people would have lived around. And then the nobility would have been inside, and they would have ran into the city when there was attack. This is the actual approach up to that road and the main gate here that we're going to be looking at. The type of masonry is called cyclopic masonry because of really large stones, and said to be that they must have been moved into place by Cyclops to be able to have been stacked up and built that way. So the Cyclops is a mythological race of one-eyed giants, and so that was what they named it, Cyclopean masonry, the stonework, after them, because they thought it must have been Cyclopses who moved these giant stones into place. So really, really, really well fortified site. We're going to look at the road up to the gate now. This is pretty amazing. This is the main entrance, and this is an area above it called a relieving triangle. You can imagine if you were somebody trying to attack this place and there's only one ramp and you had to go uphill to get to the gate, and from around you there's all these different walls where people could hurl things down on you and attack you, Even see it's diagonal, so you can't climb up. I mean, you have a space with like a little valley that they can attack you. It's going to be pretty hard to actually get inside this city and overrun it. And this is all very purposeful. So this is a very defensive entrance. It was also about impressing their enemies and people who might think of them as want to think about attacking them, or people who are coming to pay tribute to them. And you can see inside here, this is called a relieving triangle because see how this is weighted? This would be weight. If you imagine this triangle helps push the force outward towards the posts and the wall instead of directly down. Instead of directly down like we have on Stonehenge or something, it pushes some of the weight away, so it relieves the pressure, so it's called a relieving triangle. So let's look a little bit closer at this. We have here, this is a scale with people coming through, so it's a pretty large opening, and we're going to look at this relieving triangle in more detail. It's called the Lion Gate because of these lions. You'll notice right off the bat that they're missing their heads. They would have been carved frontally up here at the head area. We think that they possibly could have been made out of bronze, and that's why they're missing because of the value of the metal, which is a pretty realistic idea. This is relief sculpture on architecture. It's not in the round, but it's attached to the architecture, to the stonework, which we see a lot of relief sculpture used in this capacity. We've seen it already and we'll continue to see that. It's post and lintel construction, despite the fact that it's inside of a big wall and has a relieving triangle. It's still considered post and lintel construction. And we can see on there that the lions are putting their paws up on this altar. And if you notice this column here in the middle, this is the column. It looks a lot like a column, some columns we've already seen. If you think about it, if you go all the way back to the Palace of Gnosis from chapter 1, not chapter 1, slide lecture 1, I'm sorry, then this is a Minoan column that you have between the lions. And if you remember from when we were looking at the snake goddess, that there's this idea that nature obeys the mistress of the beasts, right? Well, we have this sort of idea happening again here. I told you that they would have these sort of poles outside as part of their shrines. And so there's lions obeying the mistress of the beast is a sort of idea that's happening here. Minoan columns, they represent like trees, etc., etc. They're like trees outside. They use these shrines to represent this idea of the earth goddess. And we have here also these two creatures, lions, that we've seen used a lot so far, and we're not even that deep into the book yet. They're to talk about power, and we see this. We saw this with lion hunting. We see this even now when people have lions on the two sides of their gate, on the entrance of their gate. We see this in like Europe throughout. Richard the Lionheart. Just keep thinking about all the ways in which lions are used to speak to power and strength and nobility, right? And we can imagine that probably back when these had the heads, they would have been roaring or menacing looking at anyone who was coming near this place. So it's very, very much about these ideas, these religious ideas, as well as power ideas and how those are tied together. And we can see in this object right off the way in which the Mycenaeans have borrowed from Minoan culture with this column, and possibly maybe even borrowed from their ideas about the way the world is and religious ideas as well. In any case, it shows us the contact between the two civilizations. This is probably how it would have looked when it was fully intact. And I just want to show you the scale of what we're talking about and how when you go through, you go into the rest of the area that we're going to be looking at. Pretty amazing piece. So now I'm going to have you stop this and watch the next video. In the videos from slide lecture page, this is the Palace and Grave Circle video clip from the Khan Academy. Pretty interesting video. So go ahead and stop this right now and go to that and then come back once you're done. Video because it texts you a bit about who Schliemann was as well. And then it looks at this Grave Circle A that we're going to be talking about. If you remember from the video, it talked to you about how it was originally outside of the city walls and then ended up becoming part of the city walls. And then inside there were these places of burial that was probably a line of kings, and a number of very special graves were there where it would have been located inside of the map that we had. So we went inside the Lion Gate, and over here was this grave circle that we're talking about, and they talked about in the video. So this is that enclosed circular space they talk about in the video, and you can see these upright slabs that are somewhat still intact. We don't have a lot of it. It's still pretty grand, but of course it would have been really amazingly grand when it was fully intact. There were deep shaft graves around. It probably, like they say, would have been outside of the city walls, but the city grew around it, so it became to be inside because they built walls around it as it grew. It's definitely a special place, was a special place to them, because it looks as though it was the lineage of kings were buried here, and inside of these shaft graves were some pretty amazing objects. They have some steles, upright slabs of stone over the graves, and there's some idea maybe that this was a place for even then in their time to celebrate historic moments of the past and rulers. There's level surfaces around it that could have possibly been used for ceremonies around the time when the Lion Gate was being made. So this existed before the Lion Gate, so it possibly became a place for important ceremonies even for them. This is the type of wealth that was found inside there. And Schliemann wanted to find Mycenae partially because it was rich in gold, according to Homer. Well, he definitely found gold. There were all sorts of beautiful, functional jewelry type of objects, as well as one object that is considered to be like the Mona Lisa of prehistory. So it's very, very considered to be one of the great objects of prehistory. It's made out of beaten gold, a single sheet of gold from 1500 BC. It's called funerary mask. Oftentimes it's also called the Mask of Agamemnon, because initially when it was found by Schliemann, he took it to be Agamemnon because he wanted to prove the historic reality behind the myths. And we talked a lot about the Trojan War, so he decided to start naming things to associate with myth. And so this is often called the Mask of Agamemnon. Is it actually his death mask? We think probably not. Okay, but it was from a royal tomb, and it did cover the face of a ruler, so it was a funerary mask. It has an interesting thing going on with the eyes. They're almond shaped, you can see them right here, but if you notice, there's a slit down them. So it's said that these eyes are supposed to be as if they're living and awake and dead all at the same time. That the eyes are both closed, like the slits, and open. And so there's this idea of the dead person with their eyes closed, but also has a feeling of them because of the shape of them, like they're also alive and there. So this shows us some idea that they had a belief in the afterlife, both open and shut, living after you die. It is one of the first objects that is known to be a sculpted image of a human face at life size. So it's close to pretty much life size human face, and that's really this is very early, one of the very first of those. Has interesting scroll-like shaped ears here, very stylized. This piece is very stylized in general, the way the eyebrows are, geometric stylization, right? We've talked about this quite a bit, even the beard. It would have been heated up and beaten out of a single sheet of gold and shaped, called repoussé, where they shape it, and then they beat it from behind, and then they chase it with other little chisels and add detail to it. It means refining the shapes, basically. So a really beautiful piece of art. Really proof positive of their power and wealth and prestige. What I find the most interesting about it is, in some way, this is from 1500 BC that we're looking at. It's not like realistic, of course, but it's naturalistic, but it does have some sense of a personality. And so in a sense, we're looking at the face of somebody from thousands of years ago and the way that they're hoping for an afterlife. And it gives us an idea that they were in power, they had wealth, but still they passed away and hoped for something else afterwards. I mean, these people are not much different from us, really. When we look at something like this, it's kind of easy to distance ourselves and say, oh yeah, it's interesting, golden object, yeah. But to think about this as a particular person that lived at a particular time and was buried, with this hope is pretty interesting thing. Some other objects that were found in there, this is the so-called Nestor's Cup. Again, Schliemann taking something described in Homer's Iliad, belonging to Nestor, the king of Pylos, and then trying to use it naming it to prove his connection to the myth. Not necessarily true, but that's what he was all about, basically. This is an interesting piece. It's called Dagger with a Lion Hunt. It's made out of bronze, gold, silver, and yellow. This is a better photograph of it. These grave objects reflect their wealth for sure. And then the fact that this is a weapon shows that they were warriors, that they valued bravery. They were a warrior culture. We can see that already from their masonry, the big cyclops masonry that protected their place. But it shows their sort of ideas again with the lions. We have these hunters here, and down here is a perishing hunter. And they have shields and spears. These are spears. And then there's this one lion here attacking the one who's fallen. And the other two lions flee away this way. And I think this piece actually, it shows the influence of Minoan culture again, because if you notice, there's this flying gallop happening here. See how their feet are all off the ground to show speed and movement? If you remember, we saw this in the Torador fresco, from the bull that's leaping with a flying gallop to give you that motion. So we see a stylistic convention that's been taken by the Mycenaeans from Minoan culture. What else do we see? We see a frontal eye on the side of a head. We also see sort of pinched thin waists and the same sort of quality to the figures in a certain way. So they definitely were borrowing some of the aesthetic qualities and aesthetic sensibility from the Minoans. Definitely a lot of dynamic energy in this scene. And yellow is silver and sulfur alloy together. So they're all precious sort of metals that it's made out of. Let's look at this next building at the top of the hill, the Megaron. This is the ruin looking at the inside fortifying walls. It's located up here, up there. Okay, so we've been going through the gate. We looked at the Royal Grave Circle A, and if you carried on up, we would get to the Megaron. It's got a simple floor plan, but it's a really important building for them. It's basically Megaron means big room in Greek. And it would have been a central feature of the city. Temples are not separate places from palaces, which was the same as the Minoan civilization. They had shrines inside of their palaces. This is a giant hearth in the middle of it. You can see in this picture, 3/4 view. And you can see that they definitely had influence from Minoans with the type of columns that they had and the capitals on them. So it has, you would enter through a porch with the 2 column supports out here, and then there were halls with that were covered in paintings. The halls and floors would be covered in paintings similar to the Minoan style. And then the antechamber, and then there's a throne room with a throne, and he faces the hearth. And this is basically a precursor to later Greek temples. So there's the big hearth, the 4 big columns, had it upstairs, downstairs, covered with paintings. And this is very similar to a layout of a Greek temple. So we see their architecture. I told you we're going to talk about how it influences later societies. This is civilizations. This is the influence of the Mycenaeans on Greek temples that we'll see a lot of in the next chapter. So it's going into one room after there with a central approach, and then this is the most important section with the throne and the hearth inside of it. Pretty interesting. So that's the Megaron, large room in Greek for the king's basically throne room. We're going to look at something else associated with kings and burial. It's called the Treasury of Atreus. This is the road up to it and the entrance. If you notice, it's underneath this big mound of earth right here. Pretty interesting. And this is another architectural element or building that's really important to later societies. Let's look at it from a couple different views. This is if you were walking right up to the door. And you'll see again another relieving triangle. But I want to show you first the Treasury of Atreus' location. So we were up here at the Megaron. We went through past the Lion Gate, the Grave Circle, the Megaron. Well, the Treasury of Atreus is outside of the city walls. It's a newer tomb. It's not a shaft grave like these. So it's a newer style of tomb. So it was outside of the city walls. So I just want you to see that real quick. Let's go back to this image real quick. So these are called Beehive tombs or Tholos tombs. They were very much about kingly power and authority. And they were visible mounds of earth from the outside. They were, in fact, inside domes. And this is looking at it from the side, from above and then the side. That was the door up to it. And then it's a big round chamber with a chamber off of it that's conical, like a dome. It was made by a technique called corbelling, where you stack up a little at a time, like we saw on the archway of the lion arch, how it goes up and up a bit at a time. And it created one of the largest domes. It was the tallest dome that we would see for 1,000 years after this, until the Roman Parthenon. So it's partially built inside into the hillside. And what they would have done is like dig straight down like a giant well. And then they would start to add these rocks and backfill it with earth. And then what would happen is they would have these rocks that would keep kind of building out. And they would be like poking out like a jigsaw puzzle. Let's erase this. Like a jigsaw puzzle is not the right word to say it. Like Legos is what I meant. See how each one would kind of stick out a little further than the one before? Okay? And they would have them all built up like that. And then what they would do is take and chisel away and cut. So they end up with this smooth dome. It would be smooth because they would cut it into shape so it was really smooth on the inside. And can see from this final slide how smooth, and it wasn't because they got them perfectly cut beforehand, it was they cut them in place. Pretty amazing, really. 1200 BC in this giant dome. The outside's a little bit plain at the moment, but there would have originally been some decorations and some relief things on it. There were some columns on the outside here. There are half columns of gypsum that frame the doorway, which were removed by Lord Elegant and taken to the British Museum. It was also plundered multiple times. The treasure's completely missing. And it's got this same cyclopean masonry, these giant stones. Giant stones that it's made out of, just like the walls on the outside of Mycenae. We definitely get a sense of kingly power and authority from these things. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. There's a huge, huge dome inside the earth, and it would have been full of treasure. So these kings really ruled with a lot of power, and they had these type of tombs to show their power as well. Pretty amazing. And it goes into the ideas we had in like ancient Egypt. I don't mean of the idea of the preservation of the body, but these monuments of kingly authority and power. So that takes us through Chapter 4. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. And I want to make sure you're looking at the study guides for Chapter 4 and 5 I posted in the module, so you can help you study and know which slides you need to be able to recognize, and some terminology, vocab, and such for you to look up and write down from your book, so you'd be ready for your test and give you a little bit of focus when you're reading your text. Hope you guys are staying well out there, and I'll look forward to interacting with you soon.